The G20 summit had a successful conclusion today in Bali, Indonesia. And we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Harsh V. Pant from the Observer Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Harsh V. Pant.
Thank you very much.
So, sir, the G20 summit just concluded in Bali. The presidency was handed over to India. Prime Minister Modi took over the keys from the Indonesian president. So, a successful conclusion to the summit, and one in which India's voice was heard loud and clear and also echoed by the others. So, what do you think of India's role, particularly in this summit?
I think this has been a particularly interesting summit for India. Of course, the highlight remained the joint statement where Mr. Modi's advice to Russian president was carried verbatim in some ways, that this is not the time for war. But I think it also highlighted the ability of India to shape global conversations in today's context in the way that perhaps we have not seen in the past. And so I think as the summit concluded, and as we heard from several other speakers at the summit, there is a great expectation from India as India takes over the presidency of G20 for the next year. And at a time, particularly when global order is fragmented, when there is polarization, when we are facing enormous challenges, geopolitical, geoeconomic, as well as the fact that wars are raging,
right,
which are having an impact on some of the poorest countries in the world. So I think India managed to steer the conversation, at least in this summit, in a direction in which it wanted. And hopefully that's the direction it will continue during its presidency as well.
So we've always believed in India that it is better to be assertive. I think aggression is not some stance that we take. And words like collective, together, collaborate, co-create. And now they are being reiterated more and more, and even other countries are echoing it. So do you think that this is a time when there will be more cohesiveness and togetherness in future decisions?
Well, one hopes so, but I think we also know that whether it is the interaction between the developed and the developing world, or whether it is the interaction between Western countries and Russia, we are looking at a lot of polarization in the international system. And that, I think, contributes in a way to a sense of urgency that the international order, international community should move in a direction which perhaps, as you point out, should move towards greater cohesiveness, towards a greater unity, towards a greater sense of purpose, because the global challenges need global responses. And what I think India has tried to do is to emerge as a voice of sanity among multiple conflagrations, multiple challenges where countries, nations, geographies are moving in extremely divergent directions. So I think there is a lot of burden on India's shoulders at this point, because India is probably seen as a country that can bring these multiple voices together, that can bring these divergent points of views together on a platform where perhaps a message goes out that this is actually a time when you have to concentrate on building global order at a time of great disruption. And so certainly I think India's traditional understanding that aggression is not the answer, that violence is not the answer, resonates well at this particular point amongst the most poorest, amongst the most vulnerable countries in the world, because their voices are often not heard. And India wants to be a voice of those emerging and developing countries.
Right. Dr. Pant, you spoke about the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable nations are the ones that struggle with any adversity. It affects them the maximum. And when we talk of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, they are required in a greater degree for the developing and the underdeveloped countries. What role do you feel have developed countries to play in this? And obviously, sometimes we feel that maybe they're not taking full responsibility. But do you feel that somewhere India's moving in and actually somewhere bridging the gap between the so-called divide that happens, that's going to now be bridged better?
Well, India, I think, will try to play that role because, as we know, a lot of these conversations are about that divide, whether it is climate change, whether it is climate adaptation, whether it is sustainable development, and whether it is the economic crisis, the food, fuel, and fertilizer crisis that we are witnessing today. Most of the burden is borne by some of the most vulnerable countries whose voices often are not part of the discourse. And so India, as I think our External Affairs Minister has also said, wants to be the voice of the global South in this conversation, wants to project their voices onto the global stage. And I think G20 allows India to do that in a way that perhaps other platforms do not. And we heard the Prime Minister also at the Bali Summit talk about how United Nations, for example, as a platform has failed in the last few crises. And that's a reality that the world is facing. And therefore, when we talk of climate change, India has been forefront of this conversation, saying that, look, unless the developed countries take a larger part of the burden, unless they start providing greater finance, greater technology, greater possibilities of adaptation, then I think the whole conversation is pointless. And that is something that I think India brings to the table, where it brings a certain sensitivity about the issues that the developing world is facing and can also push the developed world in a direction that the developed world has been reluctant so far. Now, for a lot of the countries, this is a difficult task, but I think for India, given its rising global stature, given the way that it has a historical connect with the developing world, certain possibilities emerge. And I would think that's an area, that's a direction that India wants to go as it takes over this presidency and as it wants to shape the global order and not merely be a recipient of the global order, wants to proactively shape the architecture of the global governance. So I think this makes it particularly important time in India's global governance role, as well as in this conversation that should happen between the developed and the developing world.
We also talk a lot about recovery, and of course there is the post-pandemic recovery, but of course there is still a crisis, less experienced in India because of, I think, wise policies, more forward-looking decisions. But in terms of how, because we're all linked at the hip, no country can progress or actually get mired in slow growth for a long time, because somewhere or the other, one day we will all be affected by it. So when we talk of the recovery scenario, what do you think that we have done well, and where do you think that India can actually, be a leader, regional leader in this area?
I think we have done exceptionally well in terms of just emerging at a time of great crisis, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And I think that adds to India's credibility that despite the pandemic, despite the geopolitical crisis, despite the energy crisis, India has been able to make its mark on the global economic order as a country, as a nation that is serious about governance, and that has been able to provide effective governance both in terms of distributing the welfare to some of the most marginalized communities in the country, in ensuring that inflation doesn't hit the roof, in ensuring that welfare schemes are protected at a time of deficient resources, but also maintaining the economic growth trajectory, which very few nations have been able to do. Despite their multiple economic programs and multiple agendas, we have seen that most nations are still trying to recover, whereas India has shown to the world that it is possible to provide effective governance domestically at a time of multiple crises like the ones that we have been facing. And that adds to India's credibility as an actor that perhaps can also provide effective governance at the global level. So as an exemplar, I think India stands out. And that means that this role that India has today is one where it is showcasing its own strengths. And I think Prime Minister talked about India's advancements, India's digital capabilities, India's capabilities in terms of distribution of resources, India's capabilities in terms of what we showed during the COVID as a pharmaceutical industry that tried to reach out to a large part of the world. And I think what India's philosophy that, Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, that ensures that India is not simply looking inwards, even at the time of crises. India is also thinking about larger public goods. India is thinking of global governance, and India is engaged in providing sustenance to some of those countries about whom very few countries think about. So during pandemic and post-pandemic recovery, when most countries were looking more and more inwards, India perhaps was one of the few countries that was trying to ensure that that inward orientation did not mar the prospects of India's growth, and that inward orientation did not come at the cost of other countries. And I think that's a message that India would like to deliver, and India would like to take forward as it takes over the presidency of G20.
So do you think that the past crisis that we have seen and are continuing to see has somewhere sensitized the developed countries to also know that actually it's one earth, one family, one future? As you said, that's how we look at it. And to see that, they cannot work in isolation. They have to take others. Do you think that sensitivity has increased?
I think so. I think that sensitivity has increased because initially the developed world was very reluctant. If you recall their response to the initial phase of the pandemic, everyone was just focused on their own health of the citizens. But gradually, I think, and to a considerable extent, because India pushed very hard on multiple platforms and global platforms, we saw developed world coming together in terms of pharmaceuticals, in terms of vaccine delivery, their vaccine production, etc. So there has been some sensitization. But I think, what we are also witnessing today is certain kind of economic deceleration that we are witnessing. That is putting constraints on what even the developed world can do. Because at a time when economic recovery is not happening, at a time when domestic constituencies want more state support from their governments, it becomes very difficult for even the most wealthiest countries, even the wealthiest countries to think globally. And I think that's what we are witnessing today in the developed world, where a lot of the clamor is for a domestic management of these problems rather than a more global outlook. And as a result, we have had a lot of concerns whether the world will be able to fulfill the SDG requirements, for example, the Millennium Development Goals, for example, will be attained by 2030, because we are moving back on a number of fronts at a number of levels. Whether it is climate sustenance, climate adaptation, green finance, green technology. We have not seen the kind of commitment that is needed to bring some of the poorest countries to where they should be by 2030. So I think there are growing concerns because of the economic downturn that the global community is facing, major powers are facing. And because of that global economic downturn, they are increasingly looking more and more inwards. And that is challenging, perhaps, the way they look at the world and how they look at global governance.
Right, I think very beautifully put. Dr. VardhanPant, thank you so much for coming on to our program today. It was a pleasure being in conversation with you.
Thank you, Gouran.